So for this part of the project, I focused on stage 6 of Erickson's theory. And so in stage 6, it focuses on um, intimacy versus isolation. Gillard and Higgs in their article stated that it's sort of like the second cycle of development. In this article that was also in my annotated bibliography, they stated and analyzed Erickson's developmental stages, where he discussed that that there are three stages in the cycle of life development. The first is the child and infant cycle, and then Erik Erikson also focuses on the adolescent stage. And then we have the second cycle of adulthood, and then the third cycle of older adulthood. So in this cycle, the goal is to find an intimate relationship and committed relationships and finding that trust within partners. And so if people are unable to establish this type of intimacy, people are at risk for isolation later into adulthood. So in this stage 6, Rogers talks about it in the book, about how during this young adulthood, people are trying to find their identity in addition to understanding their perspective on relationships and how they can develop that part of their life. In my interview, I was able to interview a African American woman who was 65 years old and grew up in the East Coast. And so she explained to me different important experiences in her stage 6 of her life cycle, right? And so she had a big importance of artistic influences, right? And so when she was in college, she attended the Pratt Institute, where she studied actually journalism and photography. And she also pursued journalism in the military and later pursued photography as well in the military and focused on that as well. She also used her photography career in the arts in California and New York, and was able to live there for a couple years. She actually discussed which I'll later discuss about some of the galleries that she worked on and some of the work she did as well. And she was able to travel from California and New York, and she discussed all of her experiences in these new exciting places where a lot of people were opening into new and different people, right? And so in this stage 6 of intimacy versus isolation, there are a lot of challenges and accomplishments that she was able to talk about. Again, I'll just go a little bit more towards the down area towards the second bullet point of accomplishments, right? She attended the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, and that was a huge accomplishment. She continuously discussed, and a lot of her accomplishments were focused on the arts. And so she also contributed to this traveling gallery in New York, um, traveling art gallery in New York, where they would showcase their art in these New York City buses. And she said that it was called the Bus Show, and it was up for about 2 or 3 weeks. And they would go different parts of the city and showcasing their stuff, right? And so she also talked about her ability in her work of sending information to the Smithsonian. And then also her other accomplishment was joining the military in the 1980s. And I'll talk about why she was able to join that later into uh, my presentation, right? And so there's a lot of challenges that she also faced. Though she was able to accomplish a lot, there's a lot of barriers that kind of played in a role in her life, right? And so the first was her religion, and I'll discuss that and how that played a part. Also, her mental health diagnosis of depression and PTSD, right? And how her culture and her religion played a role into that, right? And in addition, her religion and her culture also played a role in her sexual trauma and her inability to develop trusting relationships, right? And then in addition, there was also a back injury that really set her back into accomplishing a lot of the goals that she wanted to do. Right. And so in Rogers' textbook, he talks about this ability to kind of find their people's ability to find intimacy with relationships and finding that significant other. And if they are unable to do so, people are at risk into isolation when they enter adulthood, right? And so in this crisis, there are a lot of biopsychosocial factors that inhibit and facilitate the resolution of the psychosocial crisis, right? And so I first want to talk about the parent lifestyle and the parent and family relationships between the father, between her mother and her father and the children and the family she was able to grow up in, right? And so her father had a second grade education. Her mom was she wasn't unsure, but she knew she didn't have a high school graduation or a high school education or any kind of higher education like that, right? So because of the inability of them growing up in the during this time, a lot of their parents' focus for their children was on education and learning, right? And the ability to move up into the world was really important for her mom and her dad, right? And so I also want to touch base on her religion, which is evangelical. And this is a Christian-based religion that focused a lot on the preachings. She disclosed that she would be at church for 5 hours, and she couldn't go to Pratt because of dancing wasn't for women, and she wasn't able to dress a certain way. So there's a lot that kind of prohibited her from expressing her true self because of this, right? And then I also want to discuss about the gender roles that were played. So her father was actually was the breadwinner and was able to provide for her whole family, while the mom stayed at home a lot of the times and was able to, keep the home front very put together on the outside. It was very, she said that she explained how it was very put together on the outside, but once people actually realized what was going into the house, the man and woman for the gender was very clear and cut in what they can and can't do. Right. And she also talked about being a Black American and African American in our culture, in American culture, right? So she discussed again the gender roles, and what women can't do and can't do, and that played a huge role in her military lifestyle and her areas of focus of learning, right? And she also talked about that the African American culture really had a taboo and a stigma attached to mental health diagnosis. And again, was diagnosed with depression and PTSD. So that really played a role in her development throughout her 20s and 30s and so forth when she was diagnosed, right? And she also disclosed about her sexual trauma, and I won't go too much into detail of that, but it wasn't something that was talked about, especially even in her religion. And she said that, not only my religion, but also my Black American culture is very taboo and stigmatized between mental health, talking about sexual trauma or any kind of taboo topic. So there are a lot of things and communities and institutions and bigger uh, bigger plays that played a role into hindering her life opportunity, right? And so she talked about her family and community first. And for an example, at Pratt, she wanted to uh, study dance, but she wasn't allowed to because in her religion, women don't dance, right? And in addition, she wanted to pursue a lot, but she kind of second guessed herself because of her family, discouraging her or not being able to support her in what she actually wanted to do. Um, despite that, she was still able to pursue, different achievements such as moving to California and New York. But she also disclosed that, I could have accomplished even more if I was able to, be accepted of what I was interested in. And so I thought that was very interesting, from a, African American woman's standpoint of, just the inability to freedom of expression, pretty much. She didn't really talk too much about social policy, um, any specific things, but she talked about, definitely her church and how that played a role, in addition to, the recession that also, allowed her to, join the army, and that kind of what brought her there. Um, Brought her to the military was, the recession in the 1980s. And so I also want to talk about Piaget's theory, of cognitive development, and um, how this also plays a role into, uh, my interviewee's development, right? So in Roger's textbook, he talks about four main stages, right? And so he talks about, mainly in the child, infant, and young adolescent stages, right? So we have sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, concrete operation stage, and formal, operation stage. And I want to talk about Piaget's theory and how people have this cognitive development during the ages of, 7 to 11, which is the concrete operational stage. And so I want to kind of talk about Piaget's theory and my interviewee's, um, life stage during that time, right? And so she grew up in the projects of Philadelphia. A lot of She discussed saying and stated that there's a lot of, instability that growing up in those areas, right? And a lack of identity and freedom because of her religious identity at that time, and how that played a role into it, right? And she specifically talked about her sexual trauma too, right? And she discussed about the trust in other people, during this time, when she was, sexual traumatized, during a younger age, and I do believe that played a role into her trusting people now. And I've known this woman for, quite a while, probably about 3 years now, and we've had a lot of discussions, about this. And she's opened up to me, and, felt that it was necessary to open up to others. So I thought this was a really good opportunity to bring up how, the trust and relationship during the concrete operational stage, when, the young adolescent is supposed to build that trust, it really inhibited her from developing trusting relationships in her future, right? And, she's a single woman now, not really trusting in any people, and she didn't specifically say because during that time, but, there's just different context clues during our interview where she stated that, it was very uncomfortable for her dating because of, the lack of trust and, the trauma that went during that time. But as I talked again about Erickson's theory, there were a lot of limitations that I did notice, that, was also in my annotated bibliography as well. And Sokol, in 2009, was able to talk about that as well, right? I also had these ideas as well, but they did a deeper, description and detail of, Erickson's, psychosocial limitations, right? So in his theory, it's very individualized, right? And so, his studies were a lot on the Western society and communities, with the middle class, Caucasian population, right? And so it's a lack of understanding that all people are different, right? And it's a lack of understanding that people are individually, have their own individual lifestyles and different factors that come into play. And also people's genetics different are also very different, right? And Sokol also talks about Erickson's theory and how it really focuses on the